In this video, I'm going to cover banking and the expansion of the money supply. The money multiplier is a similar concept to the spending multiplier that we looked at in the previous unit. So assume the reserve ratio in the US is 10%. So the reserve ratio means that banks are not allowed to loan out 100% of deposits. They must keep 10% in reserves. So let's say you deposit $1,000 in the bank. The bank has to hold 10% of that $1,000 or $100 in required reserves. The bank can then loan out $900, and let's say that that money is loaned out to Bob, and that $900 would be considered excess reserves. Bob takes that $900 that he's received as a loan, and he's going to deposit that in his bank. Bob's bank has to hold $900 times 10% or $90 in reserves, and they're free to loan out $810. And let's say they loan that out to Jill. Jill does the same. So far, the initial deposit of $1,000 caused the creation of another $1,710. Bob's $900 loan plus Jill's $810 loan. The money multiplier is calculated by taking 1 divided by the required reserve ratio. We're going to be looking at a financial statement for a bank called the bank balance sheet. First, there are demand deposits. So that refers to money that's deposited in a commercial bank in a checking account. Required reserves are the percent that banks must hold and cannot loan out by law. Excess reserves refer to the amount that the bank can loan out. A balance sheet is a record of a bank's assets, liabilities, and net worth. So when you think about demand deposits in a bank, do you think that's an asset for a bank or a liability? So in other words, the money that you are going to deposit in an account in the bank. That would be a liability for the bank and an asset for you as the depositor. Invest. Here's an example of a bank balance sheet. On the asset side, we have loans that banks make, they make money off of those, so that's considered an asset. We have reserves, and we have treasury bonds that banks have invested in. On the liability side, we have demand deposits, so that refers to the money that you and I have deposited in our bank account, and then owner's equity. So the sum of both assets and liabilities must be balanced, or in other words, they must equal. So total assets of 10,000 must equal total liabilities of 10,000. So if the bank is holding no excess reserves, how much is the required reserve ratio? So if the bank is not holding any excess reserves, the required reserve ratio here is 10%. And I know that because the reserves of 500 divided by 5,000 would equal 10%. So let's consider an example where Bob deposits $1,000 in the bank. What is the required reserve ratio? Well, if required reserves over here are shown are 2,000 and we divide that by 20,000, we would get a reserve ratio of 10%. Will the M1 money supply increase or decrease or stay the same? When Bob makes a deposit into his account, the M1 money supply does not change because the M1 money supply includes currency as well as deposits that are already in the bank. How much is the required reserves? Required reserves in this case would be $2,100. So an additional 10% of that deposit of 1,000 would need to be deposited. So that would make excess reserves now 3,900. How much more can the bank initially lend out? The bank can lend out $900 of that $1,000 deposit. $100 of it must stay in required reserves. What would be the maximum change in the money supply? The money multiplier would be calculated as 1 over the reserve rate, which would be 10. So if you multiplied that by the amount that the bank could lend out, that means that there could be a maximum change of $9,000 in the banking system. Let's consider if Bob takes out $3,000 from his bank account. Again, the M1 money supply does not change. It's just the form of that $3,000 is changing from a bank deposit to currency. How much is the required reserves? Required reserves now would just be $1,700 because he's taken out $3,000. So 10% of $17,000, demand deposits would now be $17,000, would be $1,700. How much are excess reserves? Excess reserves now would be adjusted, and those would only be $300. Assume Bob burned the money. What's the maximum change in the money supply? The money supply would decrease by $30,000. So that 3,000 times that 10 money multiplier would be 30,000. Here's a practice question for you to look at, and the answer would be D. Here's another practice question, and here are the answers to this, which is an FRQ.